Hello everyone, my name is Magic, and if you are a wedding photographer, you have probably seen this trend already, a trend of intentional motion blur. There's been multiple articles about it already. I've seen it in the rangefinder, and recently I think it was Petapixel or something like that. There's so many photographers shooting like this these days, and today I want to show you how to quickly set up your camera to shoot like couple snaps like this during your shoots if you want to try it out, and also which shutter speeds will give you what type of effects and like what can you actually achieve with motion blur. And before I start with the examples, so obviously it's a trend right now, which, you know, like if you started using this technique now and like showcasing, it's gonna look like everyone else. So that's kind of how trends works. But also if you use it smart and intentionally, like motion blur has always been a part of like artistic wedding photography. It was just not that popular. And now thanks to like this thing being trendy, I feel like clients appreciate it slightly more because they see motion blur on Instagram. They don't know how to call it, but they will for sure appreciate it slightly more. That's actually what I think. And also, like recently I shot an engagement session. I snapped a couple of photos like this of the couple, and the bride was like, oh, I like this type of pictures. Like she couldn't like, you know, phrase it, name it, but she knew that she had seen it and, you know, that she liked it. So, okay, first of all, how to set your camera to shoot like this. Okay, so no matter how you shoot with your camera, like either manual or aperture priority, the quickest way to do a motion blur with your shutter speed would be just to switch to S mode on your mode dial or on your camera. No matter what type of camera do you have, if you switch to S, you start shooting shutter priority, meaning you set up a shutter and the camera picks the rest of parameters. So camera changes f, aperture, and ISO if you are shooting auto ISO. This is how I shoot. So me personally, I shoot aperture priority with auto ISO like on my daily basis. This is like my main way of shooting. So when I switch to S, I already have my desired shutter speed set up, which is 1/30 of a second for motion blur photos. This is my go-to, you know, start setting. And then the rest parameters, so camera will just choose the lowest ISO possible and then compensate with f aperture. So this way, when I'm on a shoot and I quickly change from A to S, I already have my camera set to shooting like this. I'm gonna snap a few photos and then I'm gonna go back to my regular way of shooting. So I don't have to, you know, change a lot of parameters. I don't have to, you know, scroll aperture, ISO, anything, because everything else is just set automatically. So this is my recommendation. I think just like go to your S setting in your camera, set auto ISO, set your desired shutter speed for 1/30 of a second, and there you go. And then whatever you change from S to anything else and then go back, camera will remember the settings that you had before on your shutter speed priority. Okay, so now let's talk about different shutter speeds and what type of effects you can achieve by using intentional motion blur. Okay. So the first type of photos that you can achieve like using motion blur is just these slightly blurred photos, which I feel gives A, sort of a vintage look to the photo, B, it kind of gives a slightly more emotion, in my opinion, versus like super static, like super sharp picture. Also, you know, the fact that photographers are drawn to like the imperfections these days is because the cameras, the lenses, everything is just so perfect that we are like looking for certain imperfections. That's why I feel like this technique, motion blur, intentional motion blur, is trending these days. So in order to get that slightly motion blur, try starting with 1/50 of a second. So 1/50 using a wider angle lens like 35 millimeters or 24 millimeters, doing some walking shots or even some more static photos like this, you know, just play around with them moving and you try to keep your camera, you know, static. It's not full frame, just shaking and moving. It's you trying to keep the static frame and people in your picture slightly moving, giving you that little blur like in these pictures. Like here also 1/50 of a second on a 24 mil lens, so you can see, you know, them walking and me walking with them. So that's something else because now you can see more of a blur in the background, so like the background is slightly moving, and since I'm moving with the couple, they're kind of more in focus. Here's just one more example in 1/50 of a second. So if you have your couple, you know, moving even more, so you don't get them being just, you know, normal in front of the camera, you kind of intend them to make more motion in the picture. So in this particular photo, I asked them to just like go slightly faster. So they're like kind of running away from me here in that picture. And also with 1/50 of a second, you can see that most of the picture here is just in focus. The blur is just adding that little layer on top of that, you know, giving that more tangible feeling to the picture, I feel like. Obviously, you can try to use a motion blur if everything else is moving and you're kind of static. So in this particular case, like I'm shooting in the car, so I'm sitting in the car with the bride. I'm also trying to get just a slight blur of things that are moving in a picture, which in this case is a veil that is just like going like crazy on the wind. So here I was trying like 1/30 of a second just to get like fully, you know, sharp and in focus, like my bride, not blurry, but then having a movement of the veil blurred. This is kind of the same way of trying to shoot a picture like this, let's say. So here I'm having a very static frame, so I frame my couple right in the middle, and I know there's like lots of stuff moving in between from left to right, from right to left, and then I can use a slower shutter speed like 1/25 of a second here just to get like these people moving. But my intention here is for my bride and groom or my couple to be like sharp and in focus. Obviously, you can try to play around with this when you're shooting portraits. So here I was just asking for them to move a little bit, like this one or this one, you know, like have fun, play around with this. But here still my intention was my frame being like sharp and in focus, and just certain parts that are moving being out of focus. The other way of using this that I feel that we see more and more these days is going even slower shutter speed and get that motion like of everything. So not only the couple or certain parts of the frame, but like a full frame being like slightly, you know, shaken in terms of a motion blur. So in order to achieve this effect, you should go slightly slower than 1/30 of a second. So here I have a 1/13 of a second. So as you can see, my camera went ISO 100 as low as ISO 100, and then aperture went up to f9. In order to achieve this effect, you actually have to move your camera along with a couple. So here they're just walking and I'm walking behind them, and while shooting, I'm intentionally like moving my camera to get even more blur of the all surroundings, so I can achieve this effect of like everything shaking in the frame. And I'm specifically looking, in this case, not just them walking, but I'm specifically looking for like the parts of the connection or like ask them to do something. So it does make sense, you know. So these three photos, in my opinion, they make sense. They're walking, everything is shaking. It's a very, like they're close to each other. You can see their hands holding each other. So you're kind of invoking more of emotions by picking a certain things that you want to photograph and by photographing it a certain way. Here's one more example with 1/50 of a second, but a 35mm lens. But here asking them to come close and start hugging, like I moved my camera really fast to get this kind of emotional look in the picture. So if you have never tried this technique, I highly recommend it. I think it's fun. Don't overdo it. Don't overshoot it. Don't make a full shoot about motion blur, because I think it does make sense. Like just use it wisely, use it with intention, intentional motion blur, and let me know down in the comments what do you think about it. Make sure to check out my presets and my educational website with the Flash for Wedding Photographers course, and I see you guys next week in the next video. Bye bye.